Let's go ahead and get to some of what is unfolding around the country. Some extraordinary scenes. We want to start at Columbia University, which really has been kind of ground zero for these protests and for the crackdown on these protests. So we can put these images up on the screen. You're talking about the echoes of 1968. So here we have protesters taking over Hamilton Hall on campus. That was one of the same buildings that 1968 anti-Vietnam War protesters took over at that time. You can see they have hung a flag that says Hins Hall. That's a reference to that little girl who, it was horrible. I did a whole monologue about it.
You can go watch it.
Was in a car. Her family was killed by an IDF strike. She was still alive. She was able to call the Red Crescent. She was begging for them to come and help her. They stayed on the line with her. They got the route deconflicted so they could come and save her. And not only was she assassinated by the IDF, this little 6-year-old adorable girl, but her would-be rescuers also assassinated by the IDF, and, you know, documented on the scene that that ambulance coming to save her was just a block away. So Hins Hall, in honor of Hind and her loss of life. So again, these echoes of 1968 now being very intentionally stoked, and that connectivity very intentionally created by the protesters at Columbia. I'll give you some more updates on Columbia in a minute, because I want to show you some of the scenes out of UT Austin, where Texas Governor Greg Abbott has decided to go full crackdown mode. Any of his pretenses around free speech clearly gone. Here you can see police taking out someone, carrying them. Their hands are bound. Here you see these officers coming in what appears to be riot gear, approaching the student protesters. Here you see some cop beating the hell out of someone, fists flying there as you know, the cops are pushing up against the protesters. Here we see people being sprayed, mace, I assume, as they try to clear out this area in this encampment. And then this is incredible. So after the police cleared the whole area, this is protesters coming back in, and the police actually having to retreat. And then this is my favorite. I don't know if you guys can hear this in the background, but they're chanting, "You failed, Uvalde," because DPS was there on the scene at Uvalde, and while they're pretty courageous when it comes to beating up unarmed college kids, not so courageous when it came to rescuing these poor babies who were trapped and being murdered inside of that elementary school and ultimately bleeding out. So just extraordinary scenes there. I don't know how many arrests were made, but student protesters at UT Austin, very determined, even in spite of the crackdown, to come back in and reset up the encampment, restart the protest. Reportedly, Saagar, from the scenes on the ground, the protests have only grown in size. Yes. As a result of this attempted crackdown. So we can put Greg Abbott's tweet up on the screen. Like I said, all of his free speech commentary previously is now out the window. He says no encampments will be allowed. Instead, arrests are being made. Your thoughts on what is unfolding there?
It does look like about 100 demonstrators. This is KVUE ABC. Got to give shout outs to the local media. They're saying at least 100 demonstrators there arrested. Returning back to that Hamilton Hall, that monologue that I gave, it's very significant. I mean, they obviously did it on purpose. So 1968, that building, Hamilton Hall, was actually occupied by the Vietnam War protesters, and they barricaded themselves inside. I will say, maybe you'll disagree with me, Krystal, I think it was a mistake, because one of the things that they did is a significant amount of property destruction, and they blew open the doors with metal, you know, and then broke the glass and all of that. You can think that's significant if you want, but once you cross into the line of straight up property damage, and, you know, we're no longer in the realm of like camping on private property, which is university, and that obviously, you know, it's very different. It's actual like destruction of property, that and barricading themselves inside, vandalization. You're setting yourself up for some sort of police demonstration. And so I'll be honest, I think it was a mistake what they did, because destroying property and vandalizing. Now, at the same time, look, Columbia, you know, I don't really know what their deal is, because Columbia's like, you have until 2 p.m. and we were all prepared. We were like, okay, here we go, let's go. And then 2 p.m. comes and goes and nothing happens. And the Columbia University faculty are all there. And then they start getting suspended, but there's no actual enforcement. So in a certain sense, it's like you're setting deadlines and then nothing is happening. So I feel like they've chosen the worst of all worlds. If you're gonna have rules and you're gonna enforce them, then enforce them. But if not, they're in this tricky situation. I will also say, in the students' defense, one of the things that Columbia prides itself on is its history of student activism.
Right.
And they sell themselves about like, listen, we are so sorry about what happened in 1968, and it was a huge mistake.
On their website.
To go, literally.
They said it took us decades to recover from that.
Next leaders of activists. So in a certain sense, Columbia does not have anybody but itself to blame. But I do think it was a huge mistake to vandalize property and to break into the building, because you're setting yourself up for a crackdown. And I've said this before, as long as people are peaceful, I think it's fine. But you start breaking stuff, burning stuff, vandalizing stuff, I'm not going to have a lot of sympathy for you.
Well, here's the thing in terms of Columbia's response. Because they threw everything at these students for a wholly peaceful protest and
in the beginning, you're right.
In the beginning.
Yes.
They brought in the cops.
Right.
They threatened the National Guard. They suspended students indiscriminately. And so when you throw the whole kitchen sink at them to begin with, well, you got nothing left. They got nothing left to fear. I mean, this is something that I've, come to realize as a parent in terms of disciplining children, is your biggest fear is they realize that you don't actually have any power over them.
Careful, they might be listening to you.
Ella, Ida, Lowell, don't watch this segment. But at a certain extent, I can ground, I can take away the phone. Once you've done all the things, what else is there to do? And so that's what Columbia did here. Their crackdown at the beginning, it was so aggressive. We're gonna send in the cops and it's gonna be aggressive and we're gonna threaten the National Guard and all these politicians they're gonna smear you as anti-Semites. We're gonna kick you out of school and you're never gonna graduate. You're not allowed to set foot on campus. And when the students were like, all right, well, that's happened. What else is there left to be threatened with?
I agree, which is what you're pointing to is, and this is why it was such a mistake to initially send in the NYPD.
Absolutely.
Because initially, this is a peaceful protest. Yes, they're in violation of rules, but they sent in the cops, and then there was a huge backlash, and then they tried negotiation. And that's a big mistake, because as you said, you're suspending people, you're sending in the cops, and you're kind of boxing people into a corner, but then you're giving them deadlines, you're not enforcing the deadlines, because you're obviously, look, these people, they have no idea what to do. They're terrified of the headline of sending in the NYPD, again, inviting a new backlash. And so they kind of ratcheted up the ante. I mean, if you think about it, and this is a bad analogy, but it's like a prison, right? So it's like when you have good behavior, and then you have a violation of that. I just watched that whole Unlocked thing on Netflix, but it's very instructive about how people feel, and like you were saying about enforcement and rules is, okay, if you have a medium infraction, it should be met with a medium-sized reasonable response. So the reasonable response at that time would have been to do what they did in the interim, which is meet with them and be like, okay, guys, what's going on here? Hey, we have commencement in 2 weeks. You're all going home. If you don't clear out, you're gonna get suspended. It's gonna be a problem, and you don't want that. You've paid all this money. We have all this going on, and I think we're talking about lowering tension. But they threw the cops in, and it was a huge mistake. That said, now though, by boxing people into a corner and also kind of both throwing the cops and then backing down, they've set very unclear expectations. And now we have property damage and a wholesale, occupation of the hall. And unfortunately, I do think it's going to end in some tear gas or something. There's no other. What other options do they have? There's no other way to clear people out. If you're going to barricade yourself inside of the hall, what are you going to do? And especially if they start vandalizing, which they already did, to get in there.
Well, you could just, do what students want you to do, which is to divest.
No,
that's the other thing. I know,
but that's not going to happen.
But
the
why
students
not?
need to understand that.
But
too.
why not? Because there was a vote at Columbia Barnard, and it was overwhelming in favor of divestment.
Yeah, but the students don't control the endowment.
Yeah, but if you have faculty and students who are overwhelmingly just do this thing, then why not just do that thing? And then you won't have your hall occupied, and you won't have to send in the cops, et cetera. But I think bottom line is, like I said, these students have already been kicked out of school and arrested, so they're not
some
afraid.
Of them have. We don't really know. But I also would say this: don't throw your future away for this. I know some of these protesters. Please don't do this. Your parents spent a lot of money on.
I disagree with that.
You want to get your ass expelled for like this? What are you going to do 20 years from now?
These are people who have agency and who feel like they're standing against a genocide. And I'm proud of them. I think it's incredible to watch.
20 years from now, you'll be a footnote to history. You're going to be in some idiot on YouTube giving a monologue.
But who cares?
Maybe talking about you. You're not going to have a degree.
You will know.
Threw away a bunch of money.
There are more things to achieve in life than like getting your startup funded or getting hired by Wall Street.
Yeah, but that's not the only thing you do. You can be a teacher. You know, it's about basic.
These are young people, but they're also adults. And they're also perfectly capable of making their own decisions about what's important to them in their lives and the way that they want to live. They're not buying into this crap. This part of actually what's in my monologue. They're not buying into this crap about the only success that matters is success in terms of a capitalist marketplace. They have values. Those values are important to them. They're willing to, I think it's incredibly admirable that they're willing to sacrifice in many instances for people they don't know and will never meet. Like, that's extraordinary. And I think it's brave. I think they're to be commended, not, scolded for making the wrong life decisions.
I'm not going to scold anybody.
You are scolding them.
I'm telling you, I wouldn't do it. And I'm sitting here as a 32-year-old.
You're not doing it. And you didn't do it. And that's fine. But
I will promise you that 10 years ago, nobody remembers a fucking thing that I said. And there's a good reason for that.
But you do.
And I hope that they don't.
But you do.
No, I certainly do.
You do.
But I regret a lot of it too.
And they will know. When they're old and gray and they look back and everyone else is pretending to have been on the right side, they will know where they were and they will know what they can tell their kids about what they did in that moment.
But that's not going to feed you or your kids. I mean, ask some of these Vietnam War people how it all worked out for them in that's 20 years later, so 1988. We elected Reagan. We had Iran-Contra and all that. Like, did it really make a difference? What happened to a lot of those folks? Not much. Petered out. Nixon got elected. Law and order. Sky-high murder rates. Mostly backfired. Let's be real.
It's such a cynical view of the world, though, to say, like, basically nothing matters. No protest matters. Your genuine concern about this, you're protesting of the government, you're disrupting political speeches, nothing you do matters. So just like go out and get your bag. I think that's a really cynical and disturbing view of the world.
Not nothing matters, but a very little does matter.
Listen, here's the bottom line. We know what will happen if these protests don't proceed, if these kids don't risk the things that they're risking that, again, I think they should be absolutely commended for. We know what will happen. Absolutely nothing. We don't know what will happen if they try. And we've seen at least that there has been some pressure placed on the administration, and I think that's important. And we see globally, this is another thing I have in my monologue, we see that the people in Gaza see them. These Palestinians in Gaza are being starved to death and threatened with bombing, and the entire male population in Rafah now basically threatened with execution and murder. They see these protests, and it means something to them. I mean, that alone is, I think, significant and important. And you see the way that international pressure, you see the way Netanyahu is kind of freaking out about the fact that there's international pressure, and these students are part of that larger movement. So yeah, there are no guarantees here. You're right. There was a backlash to the Vietnam War protesters, and you're right, that could happen again. But we know damn well what happens if these kids do nothing, and that is the status quo perseveres. Palestinians are probably, kicked out of their land altogether, continue to be murdered, continue to be slaughtered. We know that's what happens if they don't protest. They think there's a chance they could change something, and I applaud them for doing it.
They may be right. I think they're wrong. I think it's a misreading of history and of power and of how that all works. Now, again, I would take it back. I don't want to scold people. I would only give you some advice that when you're very young, it can be real easy to get caught up in whatever the current thing of the day is. I'm trying to think back from 2012 or whatever, whenever I was in college. DACA, that was a big one. All right, people march for DACA. All this was all over. Sorry, look, it ended up working out. Nothing. Like, I'm just asking people to have a little bit of historical literacy and to be mindful that actions are going to have consequences. Now, you're an adult. You do whatever you want to do, and I support your right to do that, and I've spoken here openly. I support people's right to protest and all that. I would just caution folks to not get caught up into thinking, this ain't 1966 in Selma, Alabama and all that. And there's too often, lack of thinking about these consequences. Let's think back to BLM. I mean, people took to the streets. They thought this was going to be a revolution. What's the actual lasting consequence? You almost got Donald Trump reelected. You have a sky-high murder rate. Nothing changed in terms of police action. So I hope you felt better, but that's pretty much it. And a bunch of grifters got to buy mansions in Los Angeles. You didn't change anything.
You're just arguing for give up.
No,
that is your view.
Understand politics.
That is what you're arguing. Yeah. Give up. Don't try. Don't bother. If you care about something, you know what? Keep your mouth shut, stay home, and go get your bag. That's what you're arguing for. And I think, listen, the reality is we know how hard it is to have our democracy actually reflect what people want and the will of the people. But I don't know why you're even doing what you're doing here and caring about politics if you think that nothing ever matters and nothing ever changes. Obviously, we've had protest movements in our history that have mattered and have changed. We can look back at LGBTQ rights in the very recent past, where there was an organized movement and there was protest. And guess what? Change came and it mattered and it happened. The Black Lives Matter protest situation, I think part of what happened there and led to a backlash that you're right, absolutely nothing changed, is number one, the co-optation, as you said, by grifters. Number two, the lack of any sort of like organized specific demands. And number three, the fact that in direct contrast to these protests, you actually had real widespread violence and property destruction and damage. You have not had that here.
No, I totally agree. And I commend these people. I said it from the beginning. I'll explain then, why am I sitting here? Because I want to convince people and understand how power really works in this country and the ways in which it can change. So let's think about the civil rights era. There's a great series of books called The Parting of the Waters. It's three series. I highly recommend people read it. A misreading of history is to think that Martin Luther King Jr. and the Selma, Alabama March is the only thing that mattered. And it's totally wrong. The NAACP, working with Lyndon Johnson and with the U.S. Senate over a period of 25 years in the legislative process, using the protest movement to then specifically co-opt and hit the powers of center that mattered, actually resulted in the 1964 Civil Rights Act on top of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It was the perfect moment for it to actually be able to come through. That's how it worked, right? So it's not just taking to the streets. Now, I'm not going to diminish the people who took to the streets, but they're not actually the ones who really changed anything.
Well,
it was LBJ, and it was the people, Hubert Humphrey and other
the cocktail.
Yes,
so what, they didn't matter? I mean, come on,
they
that's
mattered
a preposterous
They mattered a
history.
lot less than the NAACP and the Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, and the leaders.
But you're pretending like what's happening in Colombia is the only thing happening in the entire country.
No, I mean,
again, this movement has already won the argument. This movement has already dramatically changed public opinion, especially in terms of young people. This movement has made it so that for the first time, candidates like Summer Lee can actually be out and out oppositional to, critical of Israel, and AIPAC didn't even try to defeat her because they knew she was too strong, she was going to win. For the first time, there is actual political weight on the side of the Palestinians where it's only been on one side previously. So those are all changes that are being made. And by the way, as I said, this is not the only thing that's happening. You also have organizations that are forming, that have formed, that are designed to put money on the other side of the equation, organize on the other side of the equation. You have unions that have gotten involved who have come out in favor of ceasefires and putting their organizational weight and might behind it. So to pretend like this is the only thing that's happening and so, so it's not gonna matter, to pretend that protests just haven't ever mattered in history, I just think I think it's preposterous, I think it's nihilistic, and I just think it's ahistorical.
I don't think that it doesn't matter. I think that it is part of a broader whole. And I would urge people to not overestimate what part of one whole is and underestimate the. I completely agree with you on the union part, on the Congress part, and that, why do we spend so much time here? That shit really does matter. Like who really votes for X, Y, aid to Ukraine? Why do you think we spend so much time here? Or I care so much about Congress and the way that Ukraine aid matters and explaining all this shit about parliamentary procedure, because that's the stuff that really governs our lives. Like me taking to the streets, and if I started an anti-Ukraine war protest, which I would love to participate in if anybody ever wants to let me know the next one that is happening.
But why? It wouldn't matter.
But that's my point. It wouldn't do anything. It actually wouldn't do anything. Now, if I spend some of my time here and I win the argument and I try and work, pressure lawmakers to actually do something, that's going to be a little bit different. And explaining to the people here about how some of that stuff works and to the limited extent that we actually have a check in our huge democratic system, that is a real understanding, I think, of kind of how the power works. Again, when you're 21 years old, you don't have any power regardless. So yeah, this is probably your best bet in terms of participating in the whole. I am only saying you should also think about your future and what it's like in the, and in a way, it's a little bit nihilistic to think that me getting expelled from school over participating or, breaking down a Hamilton Hall window is going to change the world. Like, I'm sorry, the most likely outcome is that you're screwed 10 years from now. Nobody remembers. You don't have a degree. You got expelled and now you're $150,000 in debt. debt. You know, I worry about those people too. I mean, I'm certainly, how are they going to buy a house or whatever? Actually, the single worst situation you can be in is to have no degree and all of the attendant Ivy League school debt, which no wonder a lot of these people are going to be in. That's just, you know, in a way, that's nihilism as well. Thinking that this is the most important thing that's ever going to happen in your life. The truth is, it's not. Almost by a large.
Stand up for the things that you believe in and you're willing to bear a cost and a consequence, I think is what we call like courage and is admirable. And yeah, they know that there is a potential price that they are paying. They're not stupid. They're quite aware of that. The administration of Colombia has made them quite aware of that. The political elites, the media class have made them quite aware of that. And Bill Ackman threatening to keep them from ever being hired. Like that shit already happened, being doxxed and smeared. Why do you think they all wear masks at the protests? That's why, okay? They're very well aware of the consequences and they're doing it anyway. And I think they deserve to be commended for that. If we can move on to the next element, though, please, to update on what Colombia is actually doing. So as Saagar mentioned previously, you had a 2 p.m. deadline issued to specifically the protesters that were in the encampment saying, listen, you need to clear out of here or we're going to clear you out effectively. In advance of that, you can put B3 up on the screen. You actually had very moving scenes of these people wearing the orange vest. These are all faculty in these like designated vests so that they can be clearly identified as such. And you can see quite a number of Columbia University faculty who are linking arms here and surrounding the encampment to try to protect these students. You also had a march of at least 1,000 students, quite a number, who were encircling the encampment as well, also in an effort to protect the students who were encamped there. But, you know, we were watching closely. 2 p.m. came and went, and there was no visible action. There were some reports of cops outside of the university just sort of standing by, but there were no actual police action to clear out the encampment as we had seen previously. But we did get this news, put this up on the screen from Axios. Reportedly, Colombia did then start, instead of using force to clear out the encampment, they just started suspending everyone. So Ben Chang, Vice President for Communications at Columbia, confirmed suspensions had begun at a press briefing at 5 p.m., 3 hours after the school had set that deadline. Didn't say how many students are going to be suspended, but confirmed they'll be unable to finish the semester, unable to graduate, and they're also going to be barred from entering any campus housing or academic buildings. So that is the Columbia response. I don't think it's probably going to do anything to tamp down the continued protests. Karine Jean-Pierre, Biden's press secretary, was asked about free speech rights and had this to say.
What is the administration's response specifically to the use of police force in some of these college campus protests? We saw this at Indiana University, Ohio State, and UT Austin.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to be really repetitive here. Americans have the right to peacefully protest within the law. That is really important here. Anti-Semitism is dangerous. I know. We've seen the videos that have pretty much gone viral out there, and I can't speak to that. We may have more to say about those videos once we look into that. We'd have to look into them. Just don't have anything to share beyond that.
I mean, listen, regardless of what you think.
But did you know anti-Semitism is bad?
Thank you for that public service announcement. I really appreciate it. Think about this. Like, whether you think that these kids deserve to have their skulls cracked and thrown in prison, or whether you think that they are exercising their First Amendment rights and deserve to not be smeared as anti-Semitic, like, this is unfolding at campuses across the country, and this is all you have to say about it? It's so pathetic.
And she's basically says she's not aware. I mean, in a certain sense, I don't really want the White House to be involved in Columbia. Like, we can have it a couple of ways.
Yeah.
The White, in my opinion, the federal government should have nothing to say about what's going on at Columbia. That should be a matter at Columbia as a private university, and it's a private place. As long as the First Amendment rights are protected, I don't really give a shit. You know, private university can do whatever they want. Now, at the same time, though, we live in the age where everybody has to have an opinion on everything.
Well, they already weighed in.
Right, and they weigh in all the time for, you know, like some random crime or wherever. If it's a trans person, right, they're like, oh my God, this is like the greatest panic in the history of the world. or something like that. It's like trans policy at the University of Ohio. It's like, well, if you're gonna weigh in on that, then you can't really be saying, well, I'm not really aware, but anti-Semitism is bad. And no, on this particular one, I haven't seen the videos or whatever. It's like, it's very selective in the way that things are.
Yeah.
So we can have it both ways. I prefer the former, but you guys have chosen this. And
well, here's the thing. I mean, many of these institutions are public universities. It's not like it's only Columbia. We're talking about, UT Austin. We're talking about Virginia Tech. We're talking about all sorts of public university state schools across the country where there are First Amendment rights have to be respected. So in that way, it really is a federal government issue. And then also it's so hypocritical with all their like democracies on the ballot and Trump's an authoritarian, whatever, and you're watching this unfold. You cheered it. You provided cover for it with your bullshit statement, smearing all these kids as anti-Semites. And now you got nothing to say about them all being, arrested and maced and tear gassed at VCU, elderly faculty being thrown on the ground and assaulted. I mean, this is insane. And you're just like, yeah, I haven't seen it. I'm not really aware. Anyway, next question.
Right.
Utterly
And
pathetic.
it is bullshit, as you and I know, that these people haven't seen it. Because they're more online 10 times than we are. So it's like, you saw it, lady.
Of course.
You know exactly what's going on.
Of course.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have Trump making go to B7. You have Trump making very clear what he thinks about this, any sort of like free speech pretense clearly over. He just says, stop the protests now. So him and Joe Biden, Karine Jean-Pierre, all on the same page apparently on this one. No daylight between them. We didn't make up an element for this, but you have Senator Marsha Blackburn, who was another one who 5 seconds ago, free speech and people have to be allowed to dissent, college campuses, blah, blah, blah. Now she's calling for these students to be put on a terrorist no-fly list. Okay, that's the sort of thing that's happening in the United States Congress right now, led in part by Speaker Mike Johnson, who had this to say recently.
We're looking at very seriously reducing or eliminating any federal funds at all to campuses who cannot maintain basic safety and security of Jewish students. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say that this is what it's come to, but that's what we're looking at. We're looking at some other things as well. I mean, if you're a foreign student here and you're participating in this madness, you don't have a right to do that. Maybe your visa should not be extended. Maybe it should be revoked if you're going to threaten your own classmates here or come here for that purpose.
So we've got, yesterday we covered Richie Torres and Mike Lawler. The Columbia Act. They want to install anti-Semitism monitors to make sure no one is saying a rally chant that they don't like at schools and threaten their federal funding if someone says something somewhere that is unacceptable to Benjamin Netanyahu. Now you've got Mike Johnson also threatening federal funding and student visas for any foreign students who are participating in protests that they don't like, who are participating in wrongthink. And you've got Marsha Blackburn saying, put these kids on the no-fly list. I mean, it's extraordinary. I should have predicted it because we both knew both sides would posture about free speech. Like Republicans, we knew they were posturing about pretending to care about it as long as it didn't conflict with their values. It would take an issue like this where there is such elite bipartisan consensus.
It's perfect, yes.
For the full crackdown, because it's exactly like, post-Iraq War and Patriot Act. It's when they agree and they use the full force of the federal government to enforce their elite consensus, that's when things get the ugliest.
No, it's terrifying. The no-fly list in particular is nuts. I'm currently listening to the latest season of Serial. I actually highly recommend it. It's about the Guantanamo Bay. And just putting myself back in time 15 years ago, you're like, oh yeah, this country lost its mind, man. This was wild stuff in terms of what we allowed, in terms of the Fourth Amendment rights, and just so many ways in which we bridge that gap. We don't need to be going back there. No-fly lists are completely unconstitutional. They shouldn't even exist in the first place. The implementation of this was a huge disaster, and any U.S. citizen placed on a no-fly list for participating in a protest against a foreign government is as un-American as it gets. The only thing I'll say is don't threaten me with a good time in terms of revoking federal funding from Ivy League universities. Because if that's what it takes, then they're all going to burn to the ground, and I'm not going to be all that upset about it. I do agree, though, Krystal, as we had talked about, if the impetus is that, and if federal funding is contingent on being Zionist enough, I mean, that's a bridge too far for me. All I want is to see these places burn to the ground anyways, but it is very clear that this is a carrot and a stick. And the big problem is that we all know they're not actually going to do it, and that Columbia will buckle, and that this will only lead to a more censorious environment in terms of all Ivy Ivy League universities, a strengthening of DEI, a decrease of the First Amendment, a decrease really of civil rights and of equal protection for everybody. And that is why I'm going to oppose it, as you know, if that's the way that's going to be implemented.
Because it's the precedent being set is we're going to use the full weight and force of the federal government to enforce a particular ideology on a school.
That's right.
And whether it's this ideology or another ideology that is by, endorsed by an elite consensus or by whatever party is in power, once you open that door, there is no walking back through it, as it is with the Patriot Act. So anyway, that was our look at what's happening, a little bit of what's happening around the country. And I think there are many more dramatic scenes to unfold between now and graduation day, and certainly between now and the DNC.
Yeah.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.